I now recognize Ms. Gunasare.
Gunasekara, thank you.
Say that one more time. It's going to.
It's all right, Gunasekara.
That's what I meant.
That's what y'all said.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Chairman Comer, thank you for being here today. Ranking Member Raskin, it really is an honor to be with all of y'all and fellow members of the committee. I have a prepared opening statement that I'll get into in just a second, but Ranking Member Raskin, you reiterated and have created a boogeyman that just isn't there. I did author the EPA chapter on Project 2025, but in the course of that, I did not work with President Trump, with any of the people who work for him directly or his campaign. And it is very misleading to suggest that there's any coordination there, because I can personally tell you it did not happen. And I am not vying for a position in the next administration. I've actually left DC and I've moved to a small town in Mississippi where I interact every day with people who live outside this bubble of gaslighting and misleading, and they actually are dealing with the consequences caused by policy decisions of this administration that isn't defined by progress, but defined by creating unnecessary hardship. I understand why it's hard to think about the political realm prior to President Trump, but the Heritage Foundation has been very involved in pushing forward conservative policies for quite a while. And the Mandate for Leadership, the latest iteration, it's the 9th edition. This is a project that has been put out every few years since 1981. So it's been around for quite some time.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Groveman from Wisconsin.
Sure. First of all, I just give you a historical quote to start things off. They asked Benjamin Franklin on the Constitution, and he said he was giving the American people a republic if they can keep it. So every 4 years we got to fight to keep that republic. Now, Mr. Carr, you kind of were interesting there, in which you implied that the Biden administration is intentionally not enforcing spent a long time not enforcing our border law, and therefore apparently intentionally trying to get as many people here as possible, which would be one way to change the country that we have permanently. Another way would be to try to get rid of the middle class. And one of you, was it Ms. Mobbs or Mrs. I'm not going to, Gunasekara, who mentioned the electric vehicle thing? That you? I think a car is something that Americans really need today to get around, I guess, unless you're in New York City or something. Question I have for you, this electric car thing, do you have any idea how much it's going to increase the cost of a car?
Well, we have a snapshot because the price of vehicles has already increased substantially to the point where a lot of Americans are priced out of purchasing new cars. It ranges from $10,000 to $30,000, depending on the chassis and what manufacturer you're ultimately looking at. But the reality is, when Americans are priced out of buying new cars, they drive older cars longer, so all of the benefits you would try to achieve by improving efficiency standards are not realized because the changeover isn't actually achieved.
Okay. As I understand it, the cost of insurance is also dramatically higher for an electric car. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of questions, too, with regard to replacing whether or not an electric vehicle is totaled once it is involved in a fender bender. That typically is a quick fix for a regular gas-powered vehicle. And then when the life of the battery, again, this ranges everywhere from 3 years to 10 years, what actually happens with the end of life, the recycling piece of that, and that all adds to considerations on insurance. And what we've seen recently is the trend as the price continues to go up.
Right. I also heard yesterday for the first time, I wasn't aware of this, these electric cars that people are going to have to buy, they depreciate quicker than standard cars. Have you ever heard that?
I've heard that as well. Again, I would just look at consumer preference. It's not necessarily about picking one technology over the other. It's what do the consumers want. And when it comes to mobility, they want an affordable, reliable car that safely gets them and their family from point A to point B. And increasingly, Americans are saying no to electric vehicles that this administration is pushing alongside state-based regulations like California that's looking to ban the sale of gas-powered vehicles starting in 5 to 7 years from now.
It's a difficult thing to wonder, but given that people need a car, the combination of driving up the cost of a new car, driving down the amount you're getting in a trade-on, and the dramatic increase you're going to have to pay in insurance, it's going to make it much more difficult to be members of the middle class in America than before these cars, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, point A to point B is usually taking your kids to school or driving to your job and coming back, going to the grocery store and coming back, aspects that are fundamental to create a thriving and healthy home. And you have to think, too, what is all of this for? Why is this administration and the Biden-Harris administration so keen on pushing Americans into electric vehicles? They say it's to reduce emissions, and for their climate agenda, but the reality is the majority of the minerals that go into these batteries are sourced from areas like China, where they not only have they have appalling environmental standards, they violate basic norms of humanitarian standards and rely on either forced or child labor to extract these minerals. So if you think big picture, it actually undermines some fundamental goals that all Americans, Republican or Democrats, have fought very hard to seek some degree of improvement.
Yeah. Another way that you try to get rid of the middle class is you cause inflation by spending huge amounts of money that we don't have. And I want to give you an example of that. We talk about the huge cost of inflation from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, but it's forgotten that the Democrat Party, if it weren't for Senator Manchin, actually wanted to have this bill be 3 times the cost of the bill that was eventually passed. What effect would have that had on inflation if the vast majority of Democrats got what they wanted, including apparently President Biden? What effect would have that had on inflation? Would have been much worse than we already saw.
Gentleman's time's expired, but please feel free to answer that.
Yeah, I would just summarize it. I think everyone has done a good job on this side of the dais, but it would make Americans' lives that much harder because of the financial hardships and burdens that have been experienced during the Biden-Harris administration, and their disregard for inflation that was predicted, especially with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and how that has manifested itself in more expensive gas, groceries, and everyday goods.
Just one other brief comment. Okay. A comment was made about the Republicans trying to ban books. Usually I think that when Republicans try to ban books, it's explicit books for sex ed class for elementary school kids. I don't think a lot of people realize that when Democrats talk about that, that's what they mean.
Chair, I recognize this is the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I'm glad we're coming in at this time because we need to set the record straight about the Senate bill and actually H.R. 2. When the Senate bill was actually published, I remember I was at a dinner Sunday night when it came out, when the text came out. I read the text of the Senate bill. Many members in the House read the text of the Senate bill. Members contacted Speaker Johnson, and we were very clear. There is no way the Senate bill should get a vote in the House, because it is a terrible piece of legislation that will not secure the southern border. House Republicans have passed border security measures, H.R. 2. We did it more than a year ago. Has Chuck Schumer brought it up for even debate or a vote in the Senate? No, he has not. Has the White House decided to reach out to the Speaker Johnson to debate and deliberate or negotiate or compromise on H.R. 2 and its elements to secure the southern border? No, they have not. They're in charge. In the Senate and in the White House, they've done nothing except a bill that couldn't even make it out of the Senate. So I think it's important to set the record straight. Oh, also, by the way, House Republicans weren't going to vote for that bill, and that was before Donald Trump even made his view known on the Senate compromise bill. We were already against it when the bill text came out because it's a trash bill. Now, moving on. Ms. Genesekera, I think I got it right. Can you explain to me what an environmental impact assessment is?
Yeah, certainly. It's an assessment a federal agency does to measure a proposed project's potential impact on the environment.
Does the Biden-Harris administration, does their EPA use environmental impact assessments?
They do in some applications. Typically, it's in the context of of NEPA, which is in conjunction with other federal agencies. But yes.
If you're trying to go through the process of, let's say, limiting permit applications for leases that have been extended to private drillers, would an environmental impact assessment be the way that you would do that?
It certainly is a tool that this administration has used. It's to analyze it to death or to keep it in bureaucratic purgatory, which with a lot of important infrastructure projects, we've actually seen. This administration has backtracked on important infrastructure improvements that we put in place to limit time for review, to limit the scope of review that this administration, again, has changed to the detriment of building out energy infrastructure projects, highway infrastructure projects, and on and on.
Would you argue that this administration is pretty adept at using these types of reviews to slow walk energy development projects in the United States?
The Biden-Harris administration is an expert at using the federal government and weaponizing those processes to undermine the development of key energy projects that we need.
Thank you so much. Ms. Mobbs, I have a question for you. You said in your opening testimony that there have been embassies that have been lost/evacuated. How many embassies have, I'm going to just say have been evacuated under the Biden-Harris administration?
There's been 7 total evacuations, and then there's been numerous partial evacuations.
What's a partial evacuation of a U.S. embassy?
It's when non-essential personnel are removed for safety purposes and then can return later.
What are the foreign policy, I would say, what's the foreign policy, what's going on in foreign policy in a specific country that would require the United States to do a partial evacuation of an embassy?
So the situation would have deteriorated so critically that they felt that they could not establish protection for those non-essential personnel for them to be kind of forced to leave. In any administration, let's say the last 30 years, how many embassies have been lost over the last 30 years, evacuated, either total or partial? I don't have the number in front of me. I could get it to you. I think the important thing here, though, is that because there's a historic number, it's because of the unprecedented levels of chaos and instability and the inability of our State Department and certainly the executive to project enough strength and power to protect our embassies and our embassy officials around the world.
Would you say that this State Department has done a fair job, an average job, a terrible job of getting Americans out of harm's way in countries that are experiencing serious security questions for United States citizens?
I think we've seen substantial and significant problems in a number of different theaters where the State Department has failed to effectively plan to ensure that American citizens are safely returned to their home.
Do you think that in Afghanistan it was wise for us to pull our troops out last and for the State Department to not do everything possible to get Americans out before it was turned over to the Taliban?
I deeply believe we should never leave an American behind. I was a huge advocate of withdrawing from Afghanistan. We were spending $2 trillion there, almost $300 million of U.S. taxpayer dollars there every day. But what we saw was basically a catastrophic failure of the State Department, of the DOD, of our intelligence agencies, of the National Security Council, of the National Security Advisor to effectively coordinate an effective strategy to allow our interests to remain and to get American citizens safely out.
Thank you. I yield back.